Welcome to Community Planning Conversations. The purpose of these programs, the series of programs, is to have conversations with various members of the community who are involved in issues of community planning. There will be a rotation of people who teach and research on the topic, people who are actually in practice, and the third group will be people who are citizen planners, both elected and volunteer. And all of these people are working on bettering our community. Today we are going to have a conversation with Lou Hopkins, who is a professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the university. Welcome, Lou, to the series. You're the first one, so this is wonderful. This is a groundbreaker. I'd like to start our conversation with Lou in talking about his book titled Urban Development, The Logic of Making Plans. Lou, how did you come about writing this book, and what is the purpose behind it?
Well, it developed over a very long period of time. But I've been teaching and, to a certain extent, advocating planning for about 30 years. And most of the time when we talk about planning, there are one of two responses. One is, of course we have to do that. We need a plan. Or plans don't work, they just sit on shelves. And when you actually get into a discussion of what someone thinks a plan is supposed to accomplish, or how a plan works, and therefore what kinds of situations it might work in, or what kinds of things it could actually be useful for, there's not a lot of clarity about what these things really are. And actually, one of the typical responses ends up being about what are really questions of why we should have government. And so the reason it's titled the way it is, The Logic of Making Plans, is that I'm trying to be very clear about how plans work, what they can do, and how plans are something different from just the basic idea of government. And the book is written mostly for people who are either studying planning or are fairly far into the field. But the idea, the concepts are still similar to what I would use in talking to anybody, citizens and so forth.
Well, let's introduce a second role you have within the community. Lou is on the Planning Commission for the City of Urbana. So I'd like to take this to the practical level and how, as a planning commission member, you would use what you have written.
Well, the way I've been on the Plan Commission for about 3 or 4 years. And part of the way I got involved in the Plan Commission was first to be on the steering committee for the recently adopted Urbana Comprehensive Plan. And in that role, I was involved in or helped in creating a plan that's slightly different in its form from many other plans, partly in order to make it specifically useful to Plan Commission members. And so not only do I use some of these concepts when I operate as an individual sort of articulating ideas in the Plan Commission, but I use these ideas in trying to help get a plan that's more useful to us. And there are a couple of recent examples. We had a case recently where a church was asking for a special use permit, which means their zoning classification allows a church, but only after a case-specific review by the Plan Commission. And this was on South Philo Road, or Philo Road Extended, as we used to call it. In Urbana, outside of the current Urbana boundaries, but as part of an annexation agreement. And Because of its location, it raised the question of where in the future collector streets would be built to link east-west from Philo Road to Race Street or somewhere in terms of that particular block, that particular section. And in previous plans in Urbana for the edges of the city, what's called the extraterritorial jurisdiction, it means the area roughly a mile and a half outside of a city that the city has the authority to at least challenge rezoning by the county and apply its subdivision rules to. But in most previous plans, the way the location of collector streets would be dealt with is a line would be drawn on the map, usually a dashed line implying something that didn't exist yet. But it would be, when you draw a line on a map, it's in a particular place. And the difficulty is that when you're planning, that is, when you're thinking about the location of future streets, you usually don't know exactly where it's going to be. You know why it's supposed to be there. That is, that we want to have some connectivity so that you can get through the middle of a 1 mile square section, as is most of the land's laid out that way around here. But you don't know which of the streets that might be in that area should be the one that goes all the way through. You don't know how many, maybe there should be 2 or 3 generally in a square mile. So what usually happens is these lines get drawn, and they probably get equally spaced through the section. But the streets almost never get built in those places. So that information isn't very useful. So in our new plan, what we have instead are what we call sliders, essentially on the line that is the existing South Philo Road. There are 2 little arrows, and the legend of the drawing says that there should be 2 collector streets ending here. We don't know exactly where, and we don't need to know right now. But as soon as somebody comes along and wants to build something that, once it's built, is going to be there, before that gets approved, you may need to decide where one of these streets is going to be. And in this case, we did, because the church parcel was roughly halfway through the block. And because of the alignment of some other streets, that was a location where it might be necessary to figure out the street. So when we needed to, at a time when there was something to really respond to, we were able to choose where that street should be. And that's an example of thinking exactly what's the point of putting something in a plan? How's it going to be used? How's it going to affect a particular decision situation? And can we draw that plan? Can we express that plan in a way that'll be more useful in place?
And is this something then that you take into the classroom and work with your students?
Oh yeah, but it not only do I take it into the classroom, but it comes from the classroom. So it's going around in circles. Some of the examples in the book actually are from student work in small communities in Illinois. And some of the examples from the way that the Urbana plan is now constructed I've already used in class. And even the case I just described, I've already used in presentations nationally. So this is all wrapped up together.
You and your students have done some work in the rural areas. What are some of the reasons for wanting to work in the rural areas, and where does that differ from the work you would be doing in Urbana, a larger community?
Yeah. Well, I would make a slight distinction between small towns and rural. Though in the urban planning field, they'd be talking about small towns or rural as unconventional. So they're both sort of unconventional things. But for over 25 years, I've been doing projects with students in small towns or relatively rural counties, places like DeWitt County, Jasper County. And small towns means Taylorville or Salem or Vandalia or Caro or places that are 5,000 to 15,000. There are a couple of reasons that we started doing those. One is that University Extension has connections to provide services in this way, and provided some of the contacts to identify communities that we're interested in and in some sense ready to work with students to do planning. Another reason is that when doing work with students, we have to acknowledge that our relationship to the planning consultants who are doing planning work as a business, that is, as a profit-making venture. And if we are working in small towns, basically the consultants cannot make that work as a planning venture, so it's appropriate for us to fill in that gap in the availability of services. And a third reason is that if a team of 3 to 5 students works in a community of 5,000 to 15,000 people, in the space of 9 months, that is in the space of one academic year, they can actually learn enough and share enough and give enough feedback that they can actually do something that's very useful to that place. Whereas in larger communities, just even beginning to understand the complexity of what's going on, it's very hard to do in an academic year.
So as an undergraduate student, did you do this kind of work, and this is how you got into urban planning? Tell us a bit about your background.
I'm trying to think of an easy way to do it. It's probably easier to work backwards than to pick a beginning. I mean, right now I'm a planning faculty member on the Plan Commission and doing various kinds of projects and small town and rural in particular. When I first came to the University of Illinois, I was actually in the landscape architecture department, not the urban planning department. And that was partly a context of the times. One description I have of what I have been doing for basically all my life is that I've been going in a straight line, and the definitions of the various professions and fields have been weaving back and forth, and they happen to intersect me at particular times, and so I jump into being in that profession. And in the early 70s, the things I was interested in, which were suburban edge development, environmental issues, and computing, actually, were much more of interest in the field of landscape architecture, and really out of the mainstream in the field of urban planning. So I was mainly a landscape architect. But from my point of view, I'm still doing roughly the same things. So when I started working in small towns and rural areas, I was actually in the landscape architecture department. I got my degrees at Penn, which means I worked with Ian McHarg, among others, who was one of the early gurus of environmental planning and landscape.
Why don't you mention one of his
Design with Nature is the book that many people would know that was
right.
Came out in 1969, which was about when I was in school. And before that, when my graduate work was in planning and landscape architecture, my undergrad was in architecture. And again, it's not that I view myself as having changed what I was doing, but that was the area of an undergrad degree where you could deal with the physical and design and aesthetics and physical form, as well as engineering and the natural sciences, et cetera. I mean, I was taking planning courses and landscape architecture courses as an undergrad by breaking all the rules of what I was allowed to register for. And then in most, I mean, one of the standard statements is that nobody knows about the field of planning or landscape architecture until they get to college or they learn about it. You don't know about it as a child. Well, I did. I'm one of the few people I know who wrote junior high school civics papers about planning issues, some of which I still have about planning issues in Cleveland, and wrote letters to the editor about the highway cut that was going to go through our neighborhood when I was in junior high school. So this goes back a long, long way.
So there's a long connection of your interests. Well, I'd like to run a thread through what you just talked about in your background and your book and what you do on the Planning Commission. And I'm aware of a smart board that you have developed. It's not something we easily could bring today to display, but maybe you can talk about it and explain how you're using that, not only in the classroom, but also in real decision-making, such as some of the decisions in Urbana.
Yeah, well, this is part of one of the other interests I mentioned, which is computing, and I'm an avid computer user. I'm not a computer expert, but I'm actually interested in doing things different from what's normally being done as uses. So one of the things that we built, essentially, was by taking a large screen, meaning roughly 50 inches diagonal, what you can think of as a touch screen TV. Instead of mounting it on the wall, we made it into a table. We mounted it as if it were a drawing board, essentially. And the key idea there was that if it were horizontal, then people would gather around it. Whereas if it's vertical on the wall, essentially one person has control of it. So,
So you think of it like a table,
yeah,
then?
it's basically a table.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like having your computer screen, and now people think of LCDs as TVs or whatever, that is thin devices. So it's pretty easy to imagine just putting one on the table. The difference here is that you can draw on it and actually just use your finger. You can draw on it, so you can do anything you could do on a computer with a mouse. You just do it. And so it's an example of the kinds of innovations in the use of computing that I'm interested in, which in that case is focused particularly on the idea of how can you get several people involved in actually interacting with a problem, with a drawing or a map or some kind of representation of a planning idea rather than just one.
And does this help the people visualize the planning question a little bit better?
Well, the actual images you could project, and you could give people in other forms. You could give them as maps or other things, and the rendition is not quite as good as we can now do with paper, high quality paper output. But the difference is that you can interact with it. You can change it. So it's not okay, this has been posted on the wall, I like this or I don't like this. It's this is here on the table in front of me and I don't like this about it, so I'm going to move it, and I can actually move it. I don't have to say to somebody, I want you to move it. I can point to it and move it around. Or erase it, or put a big X through it, or hopefully write something reasonably tactful about it.
So if you had the ultimate decision to make in planning for Urbana and you had your kinetic instrument there, what would you be moving around to improve the community?
Well, I think our experience is that some of the representations that a group of planners or maybe experienced plan commissioners might work with are not that useful to citizens. So, for example, when I talked about the representation of how to deal with collector streets, I can imagine having that available on screens or actually on separate tablets now for each plan commissioner, and be able to move one of those sliders or draw a street or say, the street could be here, the street could be here. If we allow this church to build here, it only precludes this possibility, we're keeping these open, so we're okay. Having that kind of conversation with graphics in front of you, I think. But for a larger group of citizens, it's often the case that's what's most useful is photorealistic representations, that is, pictures of what something might look like, which can, of course, be constructed pictures. They don't have to be pictures of things that actually exist now. Because those are the kinds of things that are easiest for people to respond to.
Have you ever thought about using that piece of equipment to create a joint planning document for Champaign and Urbana?
A joint planning document for Champaign and Urbana. I mean, that's a whole issue in itself, you of course realize. I think the level, the scope and resolution of interaction required for that is probably bigger than getting 8 people around a table. That might be a kind of event that would occur many, many times in that process. But another one of my recent lines is that planning is not an event. So to think of, say, a plan that encompassed Champaign and Urbana as something that might happen by gathering people around a table to work on, I think it would involve many fora or forums over several years interacting in lots of different ways, which might include that, but I don't think that would be a central part of it.
I was intrigued because I recently discovered that Boulder County, Colorado, and the city of Boulder, Colorado, have a joint comprehensive plan. And that has enabled them to do some very interesting planning aspects. So I was thinking about how it might work for even Savoy and Champaign and Urbana to have a joint planning document.
Well, I think one of the, I'll come back to the Boulder example in a minute because I think it fits this. But this is an example of sort of going back to where we began, which is why I've written the book, of setting out a set of concepts so we can talk about ideas like this. So one of the things we need to come back to is the notion of, okay, what's a plan for, and why are we talking about having a joint plan, say, for Champaign, Urbana, Savoy? What's it supposed to do, which could be it could do many different things. The idea and process of making it might have a particular intent, such as getting certain people to talk to each other, or providing a forum in which people would talk about particular ideas or questions that are otherwise not getting talked about. In addition, or otherwise, it might have the purpose of expressing joint commitments by these units. But those are two very different things. For example, if the intent is to get people to talk about issues and possibilities in ways that they aren't otherwise doing, you could accomplish that whether there were any formal commitment at the end of it or not. So you could accomplish that by having by creating an exciting game to play, essentially, that would invite people and be engaging enough that people would actually participate. And that would accomplish something. But if what people imagine they're trying to do is gain benefits analogous to a government merger or the creation of metropolitan-wide districts or things like Metro, then that's actually a very different task, and that's not per se a planning task. That's a government reorganization. It's an institutional restructuring task. And going through the process of making a plan might be one way to get people talking about things that would later lead them to talk about changing institutions. But you'd probably have to actually change the institutions before joint commitments would have much meaning. And, we can see all kinds of examples of that recently here, which remind us that it's not only Champaign, Savoy, and Urbana, but it's also 2 school districts, a mass transit district, and there are plenty of current issues on the pages of the paper to point out that it's not just getting 3 cities together. And I think in the Boulder, Colorado case, one of the reasons, and I haven't, you've mentioned this to me previously, but I haven't actually gone and looked at the details. My hunch is that it might work quite well there to have a joint plan without an institutional restructuring, because Boulder, meaning the city of Boulder, I can't remember what the county's name.
County is Boulder.
Boulder too, that's what I
Yes.
thought. So I'm speaking of the city now.
Right.
But has a very strongly enforced growth boundary, the blue line is I think what it's called in
Right.
Boulder. And because of the nature of that, and it's not really a growth boundary in the Portland sense, it's a growth boundary in the London, the greater London sense. Is a fixed growth boundary. It's not intended to change ever.
Right, it's a referendum.
So, yeah.
Twice.
Which is quite different from the nature of growth boundaries in Washington and Oregon. Now, one of the effects of that is to make very clear from the beginning what is the county and what is the city. That is, there's not this annexation game going on that, say, in a place like Champaign, Urbana, and Champaign County, is that the nature of the interaction among these entities as far as urban development is concerned is very much about annexation and the change over time and where this boundary is, which would make it, well, there are certainly shared information from the plans of these entities. There's some examples of that in the new Urbana plan too. But that's very different from the situation in Boulder, where that piece of the interaction is sort of taken off the table by this other circumstance. So you plan for your space, it's going to be your space. We'll plan for our space, it's going to be our space. And given that, it's nice to know, where our roads are going to connect up, to be sort of a trivial example.
That is certainly one way that it comes into play. But pushing the envelope on that thought, I know that you have some interesting ideas about farmland and preservation of farmland.
Yeah, this goes back a little bit to when I said I think of there being a distinction between small towns and rural planning. In urban planning, the way that farmland is usually thought of and sometimes explicitly depicted is as undeveloped land or vacant land. That is, it's viewed as simply the supply of land available for urban development that hasn't been used yet. And actually the urban growth boundary in the Oregon sense, because of certain characteristics of the legislation, it is in some ways precisely that. It's a way of deciding in a given period of time which part of this are we going to develop, and then in a later period of time we'll add more that we can develop, but we're sort of managing this process. Now, in Oregon, there's also recognition of resource lands and things in another way. It's not quite as simple as I'm making. But so one of the ways in which I'm interested in rural planning or rural land is flipping that perception to a certain extent, so that the focus is on planning in rural areas with the presumption that at least some of it is going to stay rural, but that there are still reasons to plan rural areas. So that the planning question is not how do we keep the suburbs from marching over the hill, or how do we manage the march of the suburbs to be a very efficient and orderly march, but how do we organize rural space to be a interesting and effective and productive place to live and produce things? Because an urban landscape, although we tend not to talk about it nearly as much as we talk about residential areas in urban landscapes, but an urban landscape is both a production landscape and a residential landscape, and so is a rural landscape. And much more of the U.S. is a rural landscape than is an urban landscape. And it's going to stay that way for a long time. I mean, these edges that people are focused on are a small portion of the area. So it's examples of things that might be on the table if we think of rural areas as places to be planned as rural. In McLean County, they've just approved a huge wind farm, which is a chunk of the, I'm trying to remember, it's on the order of 50 square miles over which these large windmills are spread. Now, that's not really urban development, and it's not conversion from rural to urban in the ways we don't think. It's much more the kind of rural production landscape we think of. But these things are much bigger than corn plants, and they're much bigger than trees. Their spacing is different, and the way in which they lease land from landowners is different from the way we do leasing to produce corn and soybeans. And in fact, you can do all these things at the same time. So if we think of a rural landscape in the past as being people who own the rights to the coal underneath and may deep mine it or strip mine it, and people who own rights to plant corn and soybeans on the surface, we've now got people who own rights to have windmills above the surface. And this production landscape is going on. But where do we put these things? If you're going to build these things, what does it mean about a road network? If you're going to maintain these things, what does it mean about who lives where? If people producing corn and soybeans in central Illinois still tend to live in the area where they're producing corn and soybeans, it's still relatively unusual that they live in town and commute out. It's not unheard of by any means anymore. But so does this mean more people on the landscape? Does it change the density? Does it change the number of schools? Does it change how we supply water? Does it change? And then the other obvious example is these huge animal facilities, which are essentially small cities. I mean, 1,000 cows is equal to 16,000 people, which means that the way we plan for Taylorville, we ought to be, in some sense, planning for 1,000-head cattle farm. Where's this stuff going to come from? Who's going to pay for the roads? But where should there be roads? So if we're going to have 10,000 cows and windmills in the landscape, then should we have section line roads every mile that are paved and 2 lanes wide, or should we vacate every other one, turn it into access to mile square fields, upgrade the ones every 2 miles to handle the trucks that are going to be going to and from cattle farms that have 1,000 head on them, and building sewage treatment plants for rural areas. That all of these kinds of things, and they have nothing to do with this urban-rural edge. So that's the sense in which I'm intrigued with rural planning.
Do you see having wind farms as a way to preserve the farmland, as a tool?
Well, let me argue against the word preserve. And what I mean by that is its breadth of use in that context. That there are some things, for example, preserving a certain kind of neighborhood configuration, or a certain kind of building, or a certain kind of barn, or a certain kind of farmstead, or even a certain kind of farm landscape as a visual phenomenon. Certainly Vermont and Switzerland are obvious examples of that, where we're spending huge amounts of money to do so. But in much of the rural landscape, it doesn't make any more sense to me, to talk about preserving farmland than it does to talk about preserving the suburbs or preserving cities. Because farming as a phenomena, or rural land use as a production living environment, is far from static. And it does not make ecological, economic, or social sense to pretend that we should be keeping the farm landscape as a production in its form or physical form or pattern of and density of residential the way it is, much less actually the way it was 50 years ago. That is, many people trying to preserve farmland or trying to preserve a memory of 50 years ago that doesn't even exist out there today. So again, it goes back to why I think that a better way to think about it is planning in rural areas, planning the rural landscape, as if we recognize that it's going to change and should change, and we care how it changes, and we ought to do a better job of it.
That gives me a wonderful segue into focusing on my last question, and I would be remiss in not bringing up Katrina and Rita. And we are not coastal cities, obviously, but we are in areas that disasters do come through and potentially can be a major one. What are the lessons that we should be applying to our community from what we have watched up to this point? And this will be an ongoing saga, but up to this point.
Well, to some extent, I think the lessons go well beyond disasters, and in particular, if we want to focus on East Central Illinois. Now, it's not that there are no disasters here. There are tornadoes, and there's a certain kind of earthquake damage potential for this area that people are less aware of. But nowadays, there's significant preparation for it and awareness of it. But I think for areas like East Central Illinois, we might be able to take a slightly different kind of lesson from Katrina. That, as Rob Olshansky has described it,
Rob Olshansky is a colleague of yours?
Yeah, at the university. One of the ways to think about a disaster event is it's an extreme or intense version of normal events. So when we think about some of the things that we're talking about now because of Katrina, we're talking about how do we work harder and again get energized to work on issues of race and class and provision of education and local versus state versus federal financing and the sales tax and real estate tax as sources of funding and issues of providing tax rebates to get industrial development or relying on tourism. How do we make all these things fit together? And these are questions in Champaign-Urbana without a tornado or without a hurricane or without an earthquake that, to a certain extent, and many in planning, and certainly it includes me in terms of following the news, are interested in Katrina as a particular problem of its own issues. But I think that there are plenty of reminders we can take to work on issues here and to a certain extent take, and I mean this in a good way, but essentially take advantage of their disaster to do things that have been highlighted there. But guess what? I mean, the luck we have is not only that the disaster didn't happen here, but it didn't expose us to everybody else in the world, but many of these things are right here.
Didn't put us under the magnifying glass.
We didn't end up under the magnifying glass, but we could still do something about it because we know that those issues are here.
So as your last words on planning, what is one of those things that we could work on within the area?
Well, one of the most difficult questions in Katrina is the question of representation of who the constituents are, say, in the rebuilding of New Orleans, or in the rebuilding of rural areas of Louisiana and Mississippi. And that gets much less play in most of the press, but the kinds of things I was talking about for rural planning are actually there. The notion that you have a clean slate, which you don't. You simply have an expectation of much more rapid reinvestment in physical and social infrastructure than you would normally have, but it's all the same. But the question of how do you decide who participates? In Katrina, one of the interesting problems is that many of the people who ought to be represented, that is, who ought to be taken into account somehow, are not there. They're in Houston or San Antonio or Atlanta or Champaign-Urbana and the question of who's where is not neutral to race, class, income, education. So I think as a, to come back to this question of how does it highlight something for planning, there we're working on thinking about ways to plan with a dispersed community for a localized community, but also realizing that we shouldn't be forcing people to go back, but we shouldn't be assuming that they have no say or no contribution to the future if they're not there. So, and that's a problem in planning always, because we ought to be looking not 5 years ahead or 20 years ahead, but a continuum ahead, 100 years or whatever, and those folks aren't here.
And didn't somebody mention that's even magnified because they have an election
Right.
coming up in New Orleans some November?
Right. Well, I think it's actually maybe next year. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the November election date. But the interesting thing about the election question in New Orleans, which Diane Pinderhugh, is another faculty person at the University of Illinois, brought up, is the way I described it is sort of a conceptual, abstract thing. That is, how do we deal with people in the future who are not here to express their own interests, and yet what we're really doing is setting up their situation for 100 years from now. And urban development things tend to have a lasting effect in the reconstruction. Again, you think of Katrina. A lot of what gets reconstructed is going to reconstruct to imitate what was there before because of the way ownership boundaries and everything else are set up.